Good evening. Welcome. I'm Hillary Brocker. I'm the chair of the film division at the School of the Arts at Columbia University. I'm here to welcome you to LenFest's first public event of the fall semester. History, much like love itself, is never ever done teaching. In that spirit, we're here to share a remarkable film, King in the Wilderness, followed by a conversation with my colleague from the screenwriting MFA faculty, novelist, playwright, screenwriter, essayist, and producer, Associate Professor Trey Ellis, as well as our colleague in the Columbia Journalism Program, author and visionary historian, Professor Jelani Cobb. You can read their bios in full in your beautiful little program. This screening is the first in our Complex Issues series at the School of the Arts. Complex Issues explores difference, visibility, representation through recent works by faculty and Columbia University and School of the Arts in particular. We want to have conversations here that invite challenging questions of racial, ethnic, gender, economic, sexual, religious, and cultural complexity. And we want to look at how they are articulated across disciplines and genre. Trey will, just about the run of the evening here, Trey is going to come up just after me, speak for a few moments. We're going to watch this film together and then have a conversation. Trey and Jelani will have a conversation. And then we'll have a Q&A. Then we all have a conversation. Okay. I want to thank LenFest Gavin Browning and his team, as well as our co-presenters, the Institute for Research in African American Studies and the Columbia Journalism School. I also want to thank SOA's Dream Team Dean Carol Becker and Jana Wright for their help. Thank you very much. Enjoy this beautiful film. Trey, please come up.
Thank you all for coming out. This means a lot to me. I'm just going to be very brief, and I want to thank again Gavin and everyone who worked to make this possible, especially our deans and Professor Cobb. Talking with you later is going to be really exciting for me. I don't want to say too much about the film, except our mandate was to try to take one of the most recognizable people in the world and show a new facet of him. So we'll show you the film and hopefully hear your thoughts afterwards if we succeeded or not. Thank you so much. This is just a great night for me. Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you all for sticking around, and we'll talk a little bit about it, the film, and then take some questions. I want to also thank them. The print, it looks beautiful. HBO was so generous to donate this this screening to us, and I just really their support. We couldn't do it without the support of HBO.
So let's just jump into it. And my name is Jelani Cobb, and we were talking earlier this evening, this conversation that kind of ranged through all of these different topics, but had the common theme of the way in which race has warped the idea of American democracy. And I was looking at this film, and one of the things I think I mentioned to you earlier is that we were both born in the '60s. You were born before Dr. King was assassinated, and I was born the year after he was assassinated. And in some ways, he's been this, for our generation, for people who are in that era, he's been this contextualizing figure that we didn't realize as young people, that learning about Dr. King in school, this was somebody who had only died 5 or 6 or 7 years earlier. And so I wondered how the journey of working on this film might have informed the way you see him, or what you learned about him that was surprising. Just kind of how did that kind of lifelong context of King change in the course of doing this work?
Yeah, when Peter Kuhnhart, the director, came to me and said, would you like to work with the great historian Taylor Branch about this documentary about King, first asked what was their take on it. I didn't understand. To me, just because it was the 50th anniversary of this assassination, wasn't a good enough reason to delve into something that seemingly people knew so much about. But having studied with this other great King scholar, Clay Carson at Stanford, who curates the King Papers, I knew that he was really misunderstood. And Taylor, Peter, and I agreed from the very beginning, along with HBO, that the reason to tell this story is that his legacy has been co-opted by everybody. At the moment before he died, as you see in this film, he was at his least popular among blacks and whites. And the moment he died, everybody wanted a piece of him. Literally, like Bernard Lafayette says, trying to go into his office, but everybody wanted to claim his legacy. So that in school, in terms of Black History Month, we conflate the Tuskegee Airmen with Sojourner Truth and King. It's just all part of a wash. So I knew that the true story was something that we really could get to. And then we had the possibility, because Taylor Branch has done such great research and had great personal relationships with all the people that I interviewed up here, they were going to talk to us. So I thought, they're older people, we're going to get them to speak. Perhaps for some of them, the last times in their lives, for 2 hours at a time, we get these long interviews where they're looking right into my eyes. When I see the film, it's especially potent. We use a device called a view direct, which is sort of a prism. So when they're looking, when John Lewis says, "John Lewis, do what I said," I'm like, oh, Jesus, of course. It's like I'm looking at all those people right in the eye. And they helped me sort of reclaim the legacy of King, because everybody starts to forget and make jokes about it, just because he feels like it's too big a character, like George Washington. And what I loved about working on this film were hearing people's personal stories, like the way that his wicked sense of humor, obviously his depression. I felt that I knew the man. I felt I really was blessed to get this chance to get to know somebody who take him off a pedestal. And what we try to do in the film is take him off the pedestal to activate all of us to understand that we don't have an excuse for sitting on the sidelines.
I think one of the small details that was most affecting when I first saw the film and when I was looking at it just now is that image of King where you can see he has 2 gray hairs. And for whatever reason, I think I latched onto that because there are these ways that we think of King as kind of this element of history. But were he alive, he'd be 89 years old. Like, we know people who are 89 years old. Like, it's both a testament to how recent these events were and how young he was when he was killed. And so, having seen this person who is one of the most familiar images in the world, that image was striking to me because it managed to bring this kind of novel recognition, as well as a lot of the footage too. I had never seen Zenona Clayton as a young woman, and I lived in Atlanta for years, and she's kind of this grande dame figure in Atlanta, and I was like, oh, that's her, and, I was like, oh, she's cute too. That's what everybody was kind of saying at the time. And the image of the family, and them, and the kids, like, kind of performing for them. And I wondered what that process was, and how you all went about finding something new about this person who we've seen so much.
It was twofold. The first was getting the access to these, all the most important people in his life are alive. So we talked to all of them. They gave us all these great stories. We were really, really lucky at Cunard Films. Jill Cowan, who's the head of research there, is the great detective archaeologist of found footage. She just found all these amazing, someone would tell a story and she would find the footage. In previous news footage used to always be filmed. They sent film cameras out, but it's also expensive you can't print all the film. So they would only print the stuff they thought they needed. So through Jill's research, we were able to find these archives at the networks. They could go in and find this never before processed footage, outtakes. And that's why you would get these amazing looking footage that no one has ever seen before until this film.
I thought about this narrative, and I wondered what your response of it was. That I thought, I'm a historian, and so I thought about King in the context in which King emerged, but kind of in the longer span of it, there's a group of people who are taken by force and made to become the mechanism by which other people derive wealth. And with this wealth, they create a republic. And a republic that enshrines the principles of equality for everyone save the people who have made it possible for the republic to exist. And they're maligned and abused and disregarded, disrespected, and they have a furtive hope for dignity, respect, an unshakable belief that there is some future reckoning in which they will be able to stand on equal footing with everyone else and their humanity will be recognized. And there appears to be this zenith moment in which there's a culmination of this history in a movement and a person who was not the embodiment of the totality of the history, but certainly the most vivid carrier of it, a representative of it. And then he's shot in his neck on a balcony, protesting for the rights of garbage men. And I wondered if this film, at the end of it, it felt more empowering or more depressing.
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I definitely think we're still, to me it's hard to watch again and again at the end. I come to love Dr. King, feel like I know him, and then when I was in that room when interviewing Jesse Jackson, you expect him to be like, hey, keep up alive. You think Jesse Jackson's going to be sort of like Muhammad Ali and a little glib. And in fact, he's older now, he's frailer, he's been more vocal about his health issues. He's telling this story, and I don't know where the story's going. He goes, pop! And I just almost fell out of my chair. And every time I see it, I feel that same loss again. So I think there is certainly that attitude of depression, but then I think at the end, I think, look how depressed and broke and besieged and at all sides Dr. King was, and he kept going forward. So I feel like I just don't have an excuse. And that's what I've loved about, also when we started the film, it was right after the election. And that's why at the end, when we, of course, after all the people we interviewed, we'd ask them, what would King say now? What is the work to do now? And we don't have to wait for history to come to us. We live in a very historical inflection point. So all the people that I talked to before the election would say, oh man, if I had lived back in those days and civil rights, I would have been, it's like, well, you have plenty to do right now. It's an amazing time. Right. We were talking before about my dad. When I was born in '62 in D.C., my dad was at Howard. My mom was with me. My dad goes to the March on Washington because it's just like 10 blocks away. And I said, how was it? He said, it was kind of boring. He walked back. He missed King's speech. Because he's like in the middle of like life, right? He's got a child. I'm probably crying or something, And it reminded me of living today. Like we live in this time of you can't succumb to that depression.
So, about the process of the film, what were the biggest obstacles that you all encountered? What were the things the most difficult about getting this done?
It wasn't, from Taylor Branch was he opened so many doors for us. The people, almost to the person, they were so excited to speak with us for long amounts of time that it was actually that part wasn't difficult. Finding all that footage for a long, that was for Jill Cowan, that was extremely difficult. But actually these interviews were pretty effortless and amazing. Sitting there with Joan Baez and just ask questions and she would just go. With Dorothy Cotton, I knew that she was very frail and towards the end of her life and she was starting to repeat herself a little bit, but I knew I could she had some stories still I wanted her to tell. And I also knew that she used to sing a lot. and used to sing with Dr. King. So that's why after she repeated herself a few times, they just said, hey, did you ever sing some songs and you just see this woman, you see the light turn back on in her, and she starts singing. She passed away about 4 months ago. We kind of, so it wasn't, the difficult part was the reverence we had, knowing that for many of them, this might be the very last in-depth interviews that they do. Which reminds me that I'd like to say, Cunard Films is starting something called Cunard Educational Films, and this film, plus some of their other films, are all available to see free online. And all of the people that were interviewed there were these 2-hour interviews. They might even, like Diane Nash is like one of the great superheroes of the movement. She's only in about 6 minutes of this film. I interviewed her for about 2.5 hours. Those entire interviews are available for free online for scholars, for students, for anybody at Cunard Educational Films, and that's just gone live. And I've been talking to different educational outlets. So forever people can sort of go back and use them as primary source material for any King scholarship.
There's, so can I ask you a delicate question?
I love delicate questions.
Yeah. So when I said what were the difficult things, I was kind of like hinting at another thing, which is that Dr. King's estate has been, to phrase it delicately, proprietary about him, very proprietary about him. And I wondered if that was at any point an obstacle, if you had to plan around that, and you know, was that a factor in getting this done?
It was a huge factor. We talked to we made a conscious decision not to speak to his children because they are so famously litigious. We also thought we wanted to talk about to his court. We wanted to go to the primary sources of people that were old enough to remember him in his prime. So it wouldn't add to our story to talk to them. But it is also true, as we were doing the film, we knew that they sometimes would try to preemptively scuttle other films about King. We were lucky by having Zernona and Bernard Lafayette, all of their godparents, all the people that are closest to them, Belafonte, all of them couldn't have been more open. So what I hear is that now they like the film. So, but we were very, very careful. And even, I mean, Taylor Branch, they do not have, it's not telling a tale out of school. They are very wary of, and not all of them, but it's a bit of a dysfunctional estate. If you remember at the Super Bowl last year, there was a Dodge commercial, and then they used his speech, and some part of the family had sold some rights. So we were trying to avoid all that and said, we're going to just get the primary sources and get them to speak. But another delicate part would be to talk about infidelity, right? We didn't want to do...
That was the next thing I was going to ask you.
So we didn't want to say, look, since it's already been out in other books, and Abernathy, people know about it, we wanted to make not just a film, but a film of record. So we had to talk about everything. And I think that in context, the infidelities, the depression, I think they serve to elevate the man by taking him off a pedestal. And I think what's most interesting is someone like, talking about, when people talk about like J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI's attacks on him are much more interesting than the infidelities themselves.
So I think that here's the other side of that. And I had a conversation once with a student, and I was teaching an African American history course, and we got to the part where we were talking about Dr. King fairly intensively, and a young lady in the back wanted to know if it was true that he had been unfaithful to his wife, and I was like, based upon the evidence, it appears to be true. And that became like a thing. It became a thing in the class, and it happened. That has happened more than once in courses. And the thing that I worry about is that duality of taking him off the pedestal, and at the same time, for other people, that's pulling him down to earth, or facilitating the kind of dismissal of who he was in the broader sense. And so was it a conversation? Was it a kind of needle that you had to thread? Or how did y'all approach that?
Yeah, we definitely approached it. It was definitely, we understood the sensitivity of the issue. We just knew that to not, I mean, there was a famous, or now infamous, biography of Cosby. Right, so you can do all this work about the person and then say, I'm not going to talk about this one thing because I don't have all my ducks in a row, and then suddenly it's like, you've got a big hole in your story. So we knew we'd have a hole in it.
Well, we're talking about the Whitaker biography of Cosby that did not talk about the sexual assault allegations that it could be part of a conversation. It wasn't completely unknown at the time.
But it also came out like, the book came out and a week later, like, the dam broke too. So I think that there's a way, just because, if you remember the struggles, if you're old enough to remember the struggles for the birthday celebration, Jesse Helms, all those people would point to the infidelities and say, that's why we can't have a holiday for this man. And we had to say, just because our enemies are using this information against him, doesn't mean that we cannot, it's the truth. So how do we contextualize it? I mean, what I really wanted to find, talking about the FBI informants, is like in the SCLC office, the comptroller was a paid informant for the FBI, who's still alive. So we were trying to, I was really trying to interview this man and figure out, what is his life like? How does he sleep? So those kind of stories, I think, were more interesting than just the prurience of sex.
I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, so just one or two other quick things. I wondered, very kind of general question or like softball question, but I guess what are you
I like the softball question.
Yeah, okay. What are you most proud of about this film?
I'm most proud of the emotionality of this film. I'm most proud that I think it tells a story, that I feel something. Every time I get to the end, I feel something. And when I was outside listening, I hear people laughing and crying and then feeling something. I feel like to make a documentary that, someone who mainly comes from narrative work that has that kind of emotional pull, I'm very proud of that. But also, I mean, I just feel lucky that I got to spend, a year flying around the country talking with these heroes of mine. I talked with Diane Nash. It'll be a quick story, but she'd gone to Howard University before she'd gone to Fisk as a freshman. And as I was walking away with her, I just said, I've got a call. I've got my new baby. Her name is Pamela, after my mom. She was at Howard. She asked, what year at Howard? And it turned out that she knew my mom. And I said, you don't really know my. I just thought she was just be nice to me. And so we went on a double date, and it's just an incredible story. It's like having Wonder Woman say, I knew your mom. It's like, wow. So the exploration of that has been incredible to me.
I think one of the things that was inspiring too about this was the fact that Belafonte was so prominently placed in it, because as much as people know about Dr. King, and at this point as much as people know about Harry Belafonte, not very many people know how close they were. And in one point when I interviewed Harry Belafonte, he said that Dr. King was his best friend, which was like a kind of profound thing to say. And I think that is, as well as like many of the other things about it, Ryan Coogler, the filmmaker, when his first film came out, Fruitvale Station, and he was talking about the process of making it, he said, who you are is revealed in your relationships with the people closest to you. And I thought that was, I think, what I appreciated most about this film, and that who Dr. King was lies somewhere in one degree or another in the kind of culmination of all those relationships with people who were around him.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting in this kind of Rashomon sense, that we went around and talked to all the people in King's Court. Taylor got to, he's still very close with Harry Belafonte and Andy Young and Reverend C.T. Vivian, so he did those interviews, and I did the rest. And they, and then our fantastic editor Maya and Steven, those editors, did just a fantastic job, I think, of like getting the sort of all those circular points of view to focus, to make him, I think, Dr. King, feel a little three-dimensional.
So I know there are a bunch of questions that people have. There's a microphone here, and I think that we can get a few of them in. And so, all right, so let me just say, this is not the first time I've done something like this. And so y'all know I love you. You know I love you, right? But a question is a sentence that has an inflection at the end. An interrogative. And I would like if we can be kind of respectful of everyone, if we can keep our questions to about 30 seconds, that will allow us to get the maximum number of people in. And so there it is, and I've given my disclaimer, and y'all can go from there.
Good evening, thank you for the film. My name is Cheryl, I'm an MFA student at Columbia. And my question for you is, how do you feel that the interview with Belafonte about his interracial family and also the revelation that King had a white girlfriend, how did that move the film along?
I think it was,
Why is it?
right, I think we're trying to show the portrait of King. What's so interesting, I think, what is surprising, the King as a product of sort of Atlanta royalty, right, from his father's church, then goes to divinity school. Like, he has this sort of a wider horizon than his father ever could have imagined for him. So I think that that sense that perhaps he, if he were born a couple of years later, he might have had a very different kind of life. Had he taken that job at Riverside Church, he might have had a very different life. So I think those facets of him, I think, are there to show that he had different paths in the past that he took.
I just add one thing to that that's always been striking to me about Martin Luther King's life, that in 1955, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a column in which he took note of the developments in Montgomery, Alabama. And Du Bois, in his kind of acerbic and straightforward manner, wrote, there are a great many things I expected to see in this life, but never among them was a radical black preacher. And the radical black Baptist, I think he was saying. I mean, Du Bois is very skeptical of religion, and also very skeptical of the black bourgeoisie. But the point that he was getting at was that, more fundamental about King, for his middle-class background, for his exceedingly distinguished education, especially based upon the average level of education for black people at that point in time, for the fact that he married a woman who was a music major, the anticipated life trajectory for that black person was to return home, to pastor a prosperous church, to grow older, grow more affluent, and to lead a relatively comfortable bourgeois life. And then all of a sudden he gets this dude that's rejecting materialism, and we know that he married this music major who was also a devotee of nonviolent social change before he was, and he winds up with this trajectory that is wildly out of sorts with what we might have expected of black clergy at that point in time. And I've always thought that was the kind of most fundamental and fascinating thing about King as a personality, and also the most enigmatic thing about it, that there certainly isn't among the people who they're concerned about, racism and the race question, as they would have called it back then, but getting to the radical roots and talking about capitalism and war and all those other kinds of things, I think it's difficult for us to appreciate just how far out of step with many of his peers. Even when he was denounced, King was denounced by a National Baptist Convention. Black Baptists denounced him for his radicalism. And I think it's hard to kind of grasp when you think about just how far out on a ledge he was.
Yeah, I think that's what we were trying to get at in the film, how we think of him as being so safe and how unsafe. He was taking all these unsafe positions. and was so hated on all sides. And then I think, to me, what I also, as a father, also who lost my own father too young, the relationship between Daddy King and King, I think, is so fundamental to this film. When Daddy King breaks down at the end and starts crying, I always lose it. I think that sense that Daddy King gave, just as you're saying, gave his son everything, right? Just like, here are the keys to the kingdom. This is the guy that, you know, when famous like this, when Gone with the Wind is premiering, it's his choir that's performing for at the opening. He gives him everything. He says, you could just run this Ebenezer Baptist Church when I'm gone, right? And then it's like, no, he gave him the tools to fly much higher than Daddy King ever thought that he could. And then he pays that price.
Hi. Hi, I'm June Cross from the Journalism School. Can you talk about how your background as a narrative fiction screenwriter played into the telling of this story?
Right. Well, as the executive producer in this one, that Peter Kuhnert was the director. The editors have a lot of say in shaping, and then I always bring, and this is the second documentary I've worked on, and I'm doing another one now, co-directing one with the Kuhnerts. I always bring, and what I teach in the MFA, my MFA courses, is that storytelling is storytelling. So there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's questions that are answered. I try to bring all those sort of storytelling narrative tricks of the trade to every cut of the film that I would see. So if you like intercutting between, people talking about the same story, raising a question, cutting away before you answer, coming back to it. So a lot of that, all of those same tricks, I think, to elicit the kind of response we want to get from the audience, I think, we brought to bear in this film.
There, the microphone down here in the corner. Mm-hmm.
I think there isn't an end, and I thought you portrayed it very well in the film. All of those people. I mean, Martin said, you've got to grapple with what there is, and all of those people have gone on and done that in their own different ways. Since I'm of that generation and knew at least of many of them, did you deliberately portray that? And I'm just wondering if everybody, in a sense, got that. Certainly the message was there from Martin, but everybody else basically has demonstrated that. Was that deliberate on your part, or it's just because of the nature of the people?
Of their sort of indefatigable spirit of like moving forward and keep pressing forward?
They've all done something
afterwards.
in their lives to continue.
Right. So the question is like, do they keep going after? So when Andy Young, I love the sadness he has when he says we couldn't keep it together. But then you also think, wait a minute, you were the ambassador to the UN. You went on to do a lot of stuff, my friend. You have a big full life. John Lewis, all these people, it fractured and splintered and a lot of different flowers bloomed. So I think you're absolutely right that when you see Marion Wright Edelman, you might not even know that she was part of that original core of people, one of the founders of SNCC and part of Lunch Count, all that stuff, and Dan Nash. I mean, just like that small group of people, they all went off and started all their own movements. I think it's an amazing thing. But you also see that he, by dint of his strong personality, he was able to focus all these great personalities under him, and then afterwards they're all over saying, you know what, I'm going to do my own thing, for better and for worse. And in the long term, it has been, I think we've gained by all of those flowers blooming.
David has a
I'm going to,
question.
in hopefully 30 seconds, stick with the historian sitting next to you.
I'll cut you off in a second,
Yeah,
David.
I'm going. Just to go pick up on some of the earlier questions, I mean, you're left with this sense of, is this an endorsement of nonviolent civil disobedience, or does it show its limits and with what happened after and where we are today? But let me go back further in history, which is, there wasn't ultimately a discussion about Gandhi and talk about the radical sort of the adoption of Gandhian nonviolence. And of course, there's another icon of social change who was murdered exactly 20 years, before King. And I just wonder, it may be that it's just out of the frame of the film, because a lot of that discussion goes back to the bus boycott and earlier. But was there any thought about that historical antecedent and the importing of that Gandhian idea that was, very specific to a culture that was not our own?
Right. Well, in the 2-hour movie, we decided to focus on a lot of people will say, oh, if King had lived, what would he have done? And then our marching orders for our film were, in fact, as we see in the very beginning of the film, all the great things that most people think of that King has already done, they're over by 65.
Yeah.
So from 65 to 68, we can say, in fact, before he gets those gray hairs, here's what he did as an older man, as an old, still like in his late 30s, but here's all the things that he did without the spotlight on him, or with a critical eye on him. In terms of nonviolence, especially talk to someone like Bernard Lafayette, who still to this day, the guy's flying around the world. He will go into prisons in Colombia and do nonviolent workshops with drug gangs there. So this idea of nonviolent change, to me, I think it proves. I think it's implicitly there's an implicit criticism of Stokely Carmichael in the film, and how short-sighted that was. King would just say, we don't have the guns, what are you going to do violently that's going to make a difference? So I think that, to me, when I look at the King message, and then I look at the Parkland kids and the march, the anti-gun violence march on Washington, look at the flash mobs at Kennedy Airport for the deportees, I see King all over that. And in fact, King's granddaughter was at the Parkland, speaking at the
That's
Parkland demonstration.
Great, thanks.
Gentleman right here.
My name is Elvis, Obama Foundation scholar working with the Columbia World Project. My concern is how in the movie you try to bring out the message of nonviolence, just almost similar to what he asked. Martin Luther King said that nonviolence is as contagious as violence. And I'm really happy the way you try to demonstrate in the movie the act of violence when the blacks were being pushed to the wall. And at the end of the movie, my question is, do you have the feeling that the message of nonviolence was actually really believed by the people who followed or Martin Luther King, or at some point in time they were contaminated by the violence? Because like back in my country, now where there is a violence going on between the Anglophones and the Francophones, the Anglophones started with nonviolence, and they took peace plans on the streets, nonviolence, but now it's an arms conflict. All those who were for nonviolence have picked up arms because they were pushed to the wall at some point in time, now to start fighting for self-defense. So in this movie, do you have the feeling that the message of nonviolence actually got to the people that were following Martin Luther King?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that nonviolence is a tough, it's always going to be harder. And I think that the violence, there's a cynicism to violence that we have to guard against. And I think we try to portray that. I think that, but there are people, Diane Nash, she says she's not particularly she doesn't think of herself as a nonviolent actor. Harry Belafonte said he wasn't until he saw how it worked. He had to be convinced by King. I think there's an enlightened self-interest in if you're disadvantaged numerically or through or less powered, to embracing nonviolence. And I think certainly Gandhi saw that. But I agree that it's always tricky, and it's tricky for someone, let's say, who writes, going to Professor Cross's question about, I just wrote an action movie with a lot of guns and things blown up. That stuff is really exciting and fun, right? So certainly if I think about, would I rather dress like King or dress like the Panthers, right? I'd much rather dress like the Panthers. I think there's something seductive about that. So I think that we're going to go back and forth. And sometimes you get, when you think about Antifa versus the Nazis, right? You just think, well, if they're Nazis, are you going to talk to them, or are you going to just meet their violence with violence? I think it's a big question. And I'm a Zen Buddhist. We try to be nonviolent as much as possible, but there are also times when you just don't have a choice. But I think the times you usually have much more of a choice than you think you have. And I think you have a sliding scale between violence and nonviolence. But using wisdom and patience, you can stay veer to the nonviolence a lot more than the world has done up to this point.
Where are you from?
Cameroon.
Cameroon. So I think to that point, in a more contemporary context, when we saw Charleston and the 9 people in the church who were killed, and immediately after, when the family members came out and said that they forgave Dylan Roof, and when I was in Charleston covering that, and there was a disturbing dissonance in that the white people I talked to in Charleston were over the top in terms of that. They, like, a woman told me, literally in the Confederate Museum, told me that she was so thrilled at how forgiving the black people had been after that. And I was kind of like, And then I thought about my nephew, who called me, like, incensed. And he said, I don't understand how they forgave them. And I said, the thing is, like, you don't allow people to drive you to hate them, because then they benefit. In the end, you lose. And then my nephew said, well, it seems like they've hated us since we got here, and they seem to be doing pretty well. And I was like, yeah, okay, well, so much for that.
Right, I think but it's also true. Andy Young, I think think of, like, from working with King to the UN, when he talks about that bitterness, those reasons to be angry and spiteful, they corrode your soul. How do you feel in your heart when you're committing violence, when you're feeling hate, when you're feeling those kind of heated negative emotions? They don't feel great, right? You can feel in your heart that there's something corrosive about that. So it's like a fight. You can't have that fight emotion over the long term. So I think you have to understand. I think and Andy Young has been, he had a lot of reasons he could have been very cynical afterwards. He could have been very embittered after watching what happened to his best friend. But instead, most of them pivoted, and it became the proof of the power of nonviolence. And I was never as nonviolent until I didn't ever think of myself as nonviolent until I started working on this film and sitting there talking with Bernard Lafayette and Andy Young about these things.
I think we can get one, and if we are, like, succinct, maybe 2 questions in before. Okay, right here.
Hello, Renisha Blaché, doctoral student at Teachers College, education background. In light of education, I didn't see, and forgive me if I missed it, King's speech or an excerpt of it, of him speaking about the idea that he thought maybe he had led his people into a burning house, and his ideas around that. You can elaborate on that, or what I did or didn't?
Right, well, that's part of the, he's had a lot of speeches, said a lot of different things, and part of using the speeches was a part of that issue with the King family and his papers and rights. So we also knew that a lot of the speeches, that's a great one, but people had heard parts of them. So in general, it was a little bit of a dance to show when he was speaking at a news conference, we could have all of that. But when he actually had a speech that had been copyrighted, it was a little trickier. So that was mainly a rights issue.
So I think this gentleman gets the last question.
You just said I can repeat it.
Sorry. So I liked how your film really portrayed the inclusion message. It's all across all races. It's really a message of inclusion and how they organize to get laws passed and all that. My question is, as you mentioned, there's a lot to be done right now, but I feel we're in, like, fleeting news cycles and the message is getting lost in commotion. is there anything you maybe picked up from past efforts, from your conversations with these, with these heroes, but do you feel we could bring back and maybe help messaging now?
I wish I had like one pithy, well, yes, and then we'd all like fix, and then cut to Trump has resigned and everything's great. I take heart, I think, and Diane Nash talks about this a lot. If you look at the full interview of hers, is how much, like, any small thing in the direction you're trying to go is positive, right? I think what we do, and I think it's easy to say, it's too big, I'm not gonna even start in that direction because I'm so afraid of failing. So when I see people, again, like, if there's anything close or far, if again, I think of this immigration issue, when if you find that there's a center where children have been taken from their mothers and fathers on the border in Texas, and now they're living in a house in Brooklyn, the people that go into that house and standing outside and being counted. I think every time you do that, you're going to meet more like-minded people. You're going to meet more. It's like that's how the resistance will keep building, by these small acts that'll build and build into bigger acts. I think instead of just waiting for the midterms and kind of crossing your fingers and watching, like obsessively, like me, Nate Silver, to see what the chances are that you take back the House, figure out what other positive steps can I do in my writing or in my or with my feet or with my wallet to make a difference in a small way. And that's what I saw from them, that they weren't super organized, they were a small group of people, but they were pure in the sense that they just said, this is what the right thing to do is, even if we don't think it's gonna, even if I'm not gonna get to the mountaintop, I'm gonna head towards that mountain.
So I think that you've been unduly harsh on the president first, because he did acknowledge that Frederick Douglass is still doing great things. If there's ever a point that we needed Frederick Douglass to be doing great things, now. More and more, being more and more recognized for it, no less. I want to say thank you. We're always trying to catch up, and I'm glad that we had a chance to catch up, albeit like in an auditorium with a bunch of people. It was good to have a conversation with you, and it's very good that you all came out to watch this really astounding film, and thank you all for coming out as well.